Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we share powerful tales of transformation, hope, and the human spirit's ability to heal and grow. Today's story is about a veteran's quiet dignity, a diner owner's painful reckoning, and a community's journey toward unity. Stay with us for this moving tale of redemption. The early morning sun bathed the small American town in a golden glow, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets and quaint storefronts. The town's centerpiece, Rick's Diner, stood as a reminder of simpler times. Its neon sign flickered faintly, a beacon for locals seeking comfort in a familiar cup of coffee and a slice of pie. For decades, it had been a place where the community came together, a space where stories were exchanged and laughter filled the air. David Johnson, a man whose life had been marked by service and sacrifice, parked his aging pickup truck outside the diner. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel for a moment before he stepped out, his joints protesting against the motion. David was in his 70s, a veteran who had served in conflicts that most of the town only read about in history books. The medals he kept in a small box at home were testament to his bravery. Though he rarely spoke of them, he was a man of quiet dignity, carrying himself with the grace of someone who had faced the worst and come out stronger. The jingle of the diner's doorbell announced his arrival, and for a moment, the usual hum of chatter ceased. David nodded at a few familiar faces, offering a small smile as he made his way to his favorite spot at the counter. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, stirring a sense of nostalgia. But there was something different today, an undercurrent of tension that David couldn't quite place. Behind the counter, Rick Henderson emerged from the kitchen. His face was set in a hard expression, the usual jovial demeanor replaced by something colder. Rick, the second-generation owner of the diner, had always been an enigmatic figure in the town. While he was known for his hearty laugh and firm handshake, his deep-seated biases were whispered about but never openly confronted. Today, those whispers found a voice. "What can I get for you today, David?" Rick's tone was clipped, lacking its usual warmth. David, ever polite, smiled. The usual. "Rick, a slice of your famous apple pie and a coffee." Rick's jaw tightened as he glanced at the freshly baked pie sitting just a few feet away. "We're out of pie," he said abruptly, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the counter. David blinked, his smile faltering. "I can see it right there. Rick, fresh out of the oven." Rick's voice rose, startling the other patrons. "I said we're out." He took a step back, his body language as defensive as his tone. "In fact, we're closing early today. You need to leave." The air in the diner grew heavy, the silence deafening. All eyes were on David, who sat frozen in his seat, the sting of Rick's words hanging in the air. Slowly, he stood, his hands trembling slightly as he met Rick's steely gaze. "Have I done something to offend you?" David's voice was steady, but carried a note of disbelief. Rick's face twisted into a sneer. "You've done plenty just by walking in here. I don't serve your kind in my diner. Now get out." The words hit David like a physical blow. His mind raced back to a time when such prejudice was commonplace, to moments he thought were firmly in the past. This wasn't just a refusal of service. It was an erasure of his dignity, a rejection of his humanity. As he turned to leave, shoulders slumped in defeat, a young woman at a nearby table stood. "This isn't right," she said, her voice shaking. "You can't treat him like this." Rick rounded on her, his face flushed with anger. "This is my diner, and I'll run it how I see fit. If you don't like it, you can leave too." The woman hesitated, torn between standing her ground and the fear of confrontation. Ultimately, she sat back down, her eyes cast downward in shame. David stepped out of the diner, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in his ears like the final note of a dirge. Outside, the warm sunlight felt cruel, mocking the pain that now weighed heavily on his heart. As David climbed into his truck, his hands shook on the steering wheel. He stared ahead, the humiliation and hurt washing over him in waves. Memories of his younger years, when he had fought not just for his country, but for the very ideals of equality, resurfaced with painful clarity. Was this what he had sacrificed for? A world still shackled by prejudice and hate? Inside the diner, the patrons remained silent, their conversations reduced to hushed whispers. Some hurriedly paid their bills and left, unwilling to support such blatant discrimination. Others stayed, either too shocked to move or silently complicit in Rick's actions. Rick, for his part, stood behind the counter, his expression a mix of stubborn pride and unease. He had acted on beliefs ingrained in him by his father, a man who had raised him to uphold outdated and divisive ideologies. Yet, even Rick couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that he had crossed a line. In the parking lot, David sat in his truck, his jaw tightening as a spark of determination lit in his eyes. He was many things: a veteran, a father, a respected member of the community, but he was not a man to let injustice go unanswered. As he turned the key in the ignition, his mind was already working, formulating a plan. This was far from over. Little did Rick know, the consequences of his actions would ripple far beyond the walls of his diner, igniting a chain of events that would challenge not just him, but the entire town. David Johnson drove away from Rick's diner, the humiliation still fresh in his mind. The further he got from the scene of his public rejection, the more a fire grew within him. He wasn't a man to dwell on bitterness or hatred, but this wasn't something he could quietly let go. Decades ago, he had fought for the ideals of justice and equality. And today, he decided he would fight again, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or dehumanized. David wasn't sure where to start, but he knew who he could trust: his son, Marcus Johnson. Marcus had grown up hearing his father's stories of the war and the struggles that followed, lessons that had instilled in him an unshakable commitment to fairness and equality. What David hadn't expected was how far Marcus would take those values. Now a United States Senator and an outspoken advocate for civil rights and veterans issues, Marcus had become a beacon of hope for countless people across the nation. When David pulled into the driveway of his modest home, he immediately picked up the phone. The line barely rang before Marcus's warm, familiar voice answered. "Dad, everything okay?" David hesitated, not wanting to burden his son with his troubles. But the pain was too raw, the injustice too glaring. "I'm fine, son," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "But something happened today, something I think you need to hear about." Over the next few minutes, David recounted the events at the diner, his voice low but firm. He described the humiliation, the coldness in Rick's eyes, and the way the other patrons had sat in silence, unwilling or unable to stand up for him. On the other end of the line, Marcus listened intently, his usual calm replaced by a quiet fury. "Dad," Marcus said finally, his voice tinged with resolve, "this isn't just about what happened to you. This is about every person in that town who has ever been made to feel less than human. I'll be there tomorrow." True to his word, Marcus arrived the next morning, his presence commanding attention even before he spoke. He was tall and sharp-dressed, exuding the quiet confidence of a man who had faced countless battles in the political arena. But as he stepped out of his car in front of David's house, his demeanor softened, and he embraced his father tightly. "I'm sorry you went through that," Marcus said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I promise you, we'll make this right." That afternoon, the two of them drove to the heart of the small town. Marcus was already formulating a plan, his years of experience guiding his every move. He wasn't interested in revenge or public spectacle. Instead, he saw this as an opportunity to spark change, not just in Rick's diner, but in the entire community. Their first stop was the diner itself. As they pulled into the lot, Marcus noticed the crowd of onlookers gathered outside. Word had spread quickly, and it was clear that many were there to see how the situation would unfold. Marcus stepped out of the car, his expression unreadable, and strode toward the diner's entrance with David following close behind. Inside, Rick Henderson was wiping down the counter, his movements mechanical. The bell above the door jingled, and Rick glanced up the moment his eyes met Marcus's. His face paled. He didn't need an introduction to recognize who stood before him. Marcus's face had been on countless news segments, his voice championing justice and equality. Now, that same voice was here, in Rick's diner, and it carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. "Rick Henderson, I'm Marcus Johnson," he began, his tone measured but firm. "I believe we need to have a conversation about what happened yesterday." Rick's hands trembled as he set the cloth down. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he stammered. "I was just running my business the way my father taught me." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze piercing. "Running your business by denying service to a decorated veteran? A man who has done more for this country than most of us could ever imagine? Help me understand how that's acceptable." Rick shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if looking for an escape. The patrons who had dared to stay silent the day before now watched with bated breath, their expressions a mix of curiosity and guilt. "This is my diner," Rick said defensively, though his voice lacked the conviction of the previous day. "I have the right to serve who I want." Marcus took a step closer, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. "That's where you're wrong. This isn't just your diner. It's part of this community, and your actions reflect on all of us. You think you're upholding some kind of legacy, but all you're doing is perpetuating hate and division." The silence that followed was deafening. Rick stared at Marcus, his bravado slipping away as he realized the magnitude of his actions. But Marcus wasn't done. "I'm not here to destroy your business, Rick," Marcus continued. "I'm here because this is an opportunity for you, for this town, for everyone watching. You can choose to be better. You can choose to break the cycle of prejudice that's been passed down to you." Rick opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Marcus turned to the crowd. "This isn't just about Rick," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the diner. "It's about all of us. What kind of community do we want to be? One that lets hate fester, or one that stands together? Even when it's uncomfortable, the choice is ours." The words hung in the air, a challenge and a call to action. For the first time, Rick saw the faces of his customers, not just as patrons, but as people who were looking to him to make a choice. As Marcus and David walked out of the diner, the crowd parted for them, their expressions a mix of respect and contemplation. In that moment, the seeds of change had been planted, and though the road ahead would be difficult, the foundation had been laid. Marcus turned to his father, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This isn't over, Dad," he said with a small, determined smile. "It's just the beginning." The weeks following Marcus Johnson's confrontation at Rick's diner were anything but quiet. The incident rippled through the small town like a stone dropped into still water, forcing long-simmering issues of prejudice and division to the surface. For some, it was a moment of reckoning. For others, it was a call to action. Rick Henderson found himself at the center of the storm. His once thriving diner became eerily quiet, its usual hum of activity replaced by an unsettling silence. Longtime patrons avoided the place, unwilling to be associated with the backlash surrounding his actions. The absence of familiar faces gnawed at Rick, but it was the guilt that kept him awake at night. One evening, Rick sat alone in his diner, the faint hum of the refrigerator his only company. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty booths. On the counter in front of him was an envelope containing the offer Marcus had hinted at, a formal proposal to buy the diner and repurpose it into something new. The offer was generous, more than the struggling business was worth, but accepting it would mean admitting he was wrong. Rick's hands trembled as he held the paper, his thoughts a chaotic tangle of pride, fear, and uncertainty. His father had built this diner with his own two hands, teaching Rick everything he knew about running a business. But alongside the lessons in hard work and customer service had come an unspoken legacy of prejudice, passed down like an heirloom. Rick had never questioned it until now. As he stared at the offer, the bell above the door jingled softly, pulling him from his thoughts. He looked up to see David Johnson standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the glow of the street lights outside. Rick's throat tightened. He hadn't seen David since that fateful day. "Mind if I sit?" David asked, his voice calm but firm. Rick nodded, his words caught somewhere between his pride and his guilt. David slid onto a stool at the counter, his posture relaxed but his eyes steady. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," David began. "Not just about what you said, but about what it means for you, for me, for this town. Rick looked away, the weight of David's words settling heavily on his shoulders. I don't know how to fix it, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't even know where to start. David leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. It starts with admitting you were wrong. It starts with recognizing that the way things have always been doesn't mean it's the way they should be. And it starts with making a choice to hold on to the past or to build something better. Rick's chest tightened. For the first time, he saw David not as a customer or even as a rival, but as a man who had every reason to hate him, yet was choosing to extend a hand. You really think people will forgive me? Rick asked, his voice tinged with vulnerability. David's expression softened. Forgiveness isn't given lightly. Rick, it's earned. But if you're willing to try, to really try, you might find that this community is more willing to embrace change than you think. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between them. Finally, Rick reached for the envelope and slid it across the counter toward David. I'll sign it, Rick said quietly, but only if you promise me one thing. David raised an eyebrow. And what's that? That this place becomes something good, something that heals instead of divides. David's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. You have my word. The transformation of Rick's Diner into Unity House became the talk of the town. With Marcus Johnson spearheading the initiative, the community rallied behind the project. Volunteers of all backgrounds came together to repaint the walls, replace the worn furniture, and breathe new life into the space. What had once been a symbol of division was slowly becoming a beacon of hope. Unity House wasn't just a diner. It was a community hub. The walls were adorned with photographs and memorabilia honoring veterans, civil rights leaders, and local heroes. A mural was painted on the far wall, depicting people of all races and backgrounds standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit with determination and hope. The grand reopening was held on a bright Saturday morning. The streets outside the diner were filled with people, their chatter buzzing with anticipation. At the center of it all stood David and Marcus Johnson, their presence a testament to the power of perseverance and forgiveness. When the doors finally opened, the crowd surged inside, eager to see the transformation. The smell of fresh coffee and warm biscuits wafted through the air, and the sound of laughter replaced the heavy silence that had once filled the space. Rick stood in the kitchen, nervously wiping his hands on his apron. He had agreed to stay on as a cook, a decision that felt equal parts daunting and redemptive. When Marcus approached him, Rick straightened, his nerves barely concealed. You're doing the right thing, Rick, Marcus said, his voice steady. And that's all anyone can ask. Rick nodded, the lump in his throat making it hard to speak. Thank you for giving me a chance to make things right. As the day went on, Unity House came alive. Strangers shared tables. Veterans told stories of their service. And children played in a newly created reading corner. The atmosphere was one of unity, a tangible shift in a town that had once been defined by its divides. Toward the end of the day, Rick stepped out of the kitchen and stood at the edge of the room. Taking it all in, he spotted David sitting at a table with a group of veterans, his laughter mingling with theirs. Their eyes met across the room, and David raised a glass in a silent toast. Rick nodded, a small smile breaking through the tension in his face. In that moment, Rick felt something he hadn't in years, hope. Hope that change was possible. Hope that redemption was within reach. And hope that, together, they could build a future where everyone had a seat at the table. Thank you for watching today's story on Empathy Stories. We hope it inspired you to believe in the power of forgiveness and the importance of standing up for what's right. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt narratives that remind us of the beauty of empathy and understanding. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter. See you in the next episode.